On the morning of April 3, 2019, a 61-year-old Iowa farmer named Dale Whitmore walked into his John Deere dealership for the last time as a loyal customer. He didn't know that yet. He still believed in the green paint. He still believed in the handshake his father had made in 1971 when this family bought their first John Deere row crop tractor from this same building, from a man who knew their name, knew their land, knew what it meant when the ground was dry, and the planting window was closing fast. Dale walked in holding a printed work order. His 2017 John Deere 8370R had thrown a code overnight. A hydraulic valve actuator. He'd diagnosed it himself. 34 years of farming will do that to a man. He already knew the part number. He already knew what the job would take. Stay with me until the end. Before we begin, please take a moment to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and comment where you're watching from. Now, let's get into it. He wasn't there for a diagnosis. He was there for the part, the service. Advisor slid the invoice across the counter. Dale picked it up. He read the number twice. Then he set the paper down very carefully, the way you set something down when you're trying not to react. The part, a hydraulic valve actuator. The same part, the same casting, the same John Deere part number he'd replaced on his 2014 8 Series 4 years earlier, had gone from $834 to $2,147 in 4 years. On the same part. The service. Advisor had an explanation ready. It always surprised Dale how quickly they had the explanation ready. New pricing structure. Dealer cost adjustments, proprietary component surcharges, logistics realignment, supply chain optimization fees. Dale asked if there had been a mistake. The service advisor said no. Dale asked if that was the same part. The service advisor said the pricing model had been updated. Dale folded the invoice, put it in his jacket pocket, walked out to his truck and sat there in the parking lot for 11 minutes without starting the engine. Outside the windshield, a row of new tractors sat gleaming green and yellow in the early April sun. The nearest one, a 2019 John Deere 8R340, had a sticker price of $349,000. There was a banner above it. It read, "Your farm, our promise." Dale drove home. He didn't buy the part that day. What you need to understand about Dale Whitmore is that he was not an angry man. He was not a man who made rash decisions or complained loudly at the co-op or went home and posted rants online. He was a methodical man. He kept records. He tracked fuel costs per acre going back to 1998. He had filed folders for every equipment purchase he'd ever made, organized by year, by machine, by cost. He was the kind of farmer who understood that emotion was expensive, and that the most dangerous thing you could do in the middle of a crisis was react before you understood the full shape of what you were dealing with. So, he sat down at his kitchen table that night with a cup of coffee, the folded invoice in front of him, and he started going through his files. What he found over the next 3 hours changed everything. He pulled every John Deere parts invoice he had from the last 6 years. He compared prices year over year, part number by part number. He made a column for the 2014 price, a column for the 2017 price, a column for the 2019 price. When he was done, he sat back and looked at the numbers. The average price increase across 38 line items was 218%. Some parts had gone up 190%. Some had gone up 310%. One, a fuel injection harness he'd replaced twice on his 2015 8 Series, had gone from $307 in 2015 to $1,989 in 2019. That was 287%. He wrote at the bottom of the page, in his careful, deliberate handwriting, "This is not inflation. This is something else." He was right. But he didn't know yet exactly what it was. He wouldn't know for another few weeks, not until he started making phone calls, not until he started talking to other farmers the same way a man talks when he's stopped being embarrassed and started being serious. The first person he called was a man named Roy Alstead. 64 years old, farmed 2,100 acres of corn and soybeans about 30 miles south. Roy had been a John Deere man his entire life. His grandfather had been a John Deere man. There were 3 generations of John Deere purchase receipts in a shoebox in Roy's attic. When Dale told Roy about the invoice, Roy went quiet. Then he said, "Dale, I paid $4,100 for a GPS receiver module last fall." Dale asked what the same module cost 2 years before. Roy said, "I looked it up. $1 to $340. There was a long pause on the phone. Then Roy said, "I thought it was just me." That sentence, "I thought it was just me," would turn out to be the most important sentence in the story of what came next. Because across that entire region, across dozens of farms and hundreds of thousands of acres, the same thing was happening to every farmer who ran green equipment and trusted the dealer relationship the way their fathers had trusted it. They were all being hit with the same price increases. They were all receiving the same explanations, and almost every one of them had quietly assumed it was personal. A mistake. A bad luck streak. A temporary situation that would correct itself once the supply chain settled down, once the trade disputes resolved, once things went back to normal. None of them had done what Dale did, sat down with 6 years of invoices and run the numbers. Side by side, none of them had seen the pattern, but Dale had seen it. And now he couldn't unsee it. The issue wasn't supplying chains. The real restructuring had been happening inside John Deere itself since at least 2016. A deliberate, systematic move to shift revenue away from equipment sales and toward what the company internally called life cycle services. Parts, software subscriptions, remote diagnostics fees, precision agriculture data packages, extended warranties that required dealer authorization for repairs that farmers had been doing themselves for generations. The green paint was the same. The A logo was the same, but the business model had changed underneath it. Quietly, the way a river changes course. Not all at once, but steadily, year by year. Until one morning you look up and realize the water isn't where it used to be. Dale spent 2 weeks calling every farmer he knew who ran John Deere equipment. He wasn't organizing anything. He wasn't building anything. He was just asking the same question: what are you paying for parts and what did you pay 3 years ago? By the time he'd made 22 calls, he had a notebook full of numbers that made him feel sick. A cedar clutch assembly, up 240%. A cab pressure sensor, up 318%. An electrical control unit for a planter, up 407%. A fuel system filter housing. Not a filter, the housing that holds the filter. Up from $88 to $381. That was 333%. He brought the notebook to a Saturday morning breakfast that a handful of local farmers had been doing for years at a diner in town. Just coffee and eggs. And talk about the week. 7 men around 2 pushed-together tables. Dale set the notebook in the middle of the table without saying anything. One by one, the men around the table picked it up and looked at it. Nobody said anything for almost a full minute. Then a farmer, named Gerald Bunch, 67 years old, 3rd generation, stubborn as winter ground, looked up from the notebook and said, "So what do we do about it?" And that was when Dale told them about what he'd found on the other side of the price wall. 2 weeks earlier, when he'd finally gotten his 8370R running again, he hadn't bought the part from the dealer. He'd found a retired John Deere service technician named Frank Bauer, who lived 40 miles away in a small town and worked out of a converted pole barn behind his house. Frank had spent 26 years inside John Deere dealer service departments. He knew the parts, he knew the machines, and critically, he knew where to find parts that weren't filtered through the dealer network's new pricing structure. Frank sourced Dale's hydraulic valve actuator from an industrial supplier in Minnesota that sold OEM spec components at $490. Shipped in 4 days. Frank installed it in half a day. Parts and labor, $680 total. The dealer had quoted $2,847 for the part alone, plus $420 in labor, plus a mandatory $195 diagnostic scan, even though Dale had already diagnosed the problem himself, and even though Frank's scan said exactly what Dale had said it would say. Total dealer cost would have been $3,162. Frank cost $680. The difference was $2,182 on one repair. When Dale finished telling that story, Gerald Bunch looked at the notebook again, then looked around the table at the other men, then looked back at Dale. "How many more Franks are out there?" he asked. Dale said he didn't know yet. Gerald said, "Well, I think we better find out." What happened next didn't happen fast. It didn't happen with a meeting or a mission statement or any kind of formal plan. It happened the way most real things happen in farming communities. Slowly, practically, one problem at a time, one conversation at a time, passed between men who trusted each other because they'd spent decades watching each other work. Dale started a list. Names of independent mechanics, names of salvage yards that specialized in late-model farm equipment, names of OEM spec parts suppliers that sold direct, names of retired dealer technicians who'd left the corporate system and were working on their own. He shared the list quietly, the way you'd pass directions to a good fishing spot, not broadly, not publicly, just to the people who needed it. Within 6 weeks, 11 farmers were using it. Within 3 months, that number was 31. By the end of 2019, it was 57. By the end of 2019, it was 57. But here is where the story changes, because what started as a simple parts sourcing list became something none of them had planned for. It became infrastructure. It became a system that could do things the dealer network had stopped doing: respond quickly, treat people like they mattered, price work honestly, stand behind the repair without a software handshake required. And when John Deere rolled out what would become the most controversial policy in modern agricultural history, when the green paint stopped being just a color and started being a leash, Dale's quiet list was about to become something that nobody in a corporate boardroom in Moline, Illinois had accounted for. It was about to become a survival network, and it would work. In the spring of 2020, a farmer named Calvin Pryor lost 4 days of planting, not to weather, not to equipment failure, not to anything that could be fixed with a wrench or a phone call to a neighbor who knew engines. Calvin lost 4 days because John Deere's telematics system flagged an unauthorized software modification on his 2018 John Deere 8345R. Calvin hadn't modified anything. What had happened was this. A week earlier, the dealer had performed a routine service visit and updated the machine's firmware. The update had installed a new version of John Deere's embedded EMS, equipment error, management system, and that new version had a stricter authentication protocol. When Calvin's tractor tried to communicate with the precision planting system the following week, the authentication failed. The tractor wouldn't operate at full capacity. More precisely, the tractor wouldn't let the planting system engage at rated RPM. It would run, move. But the integration that made precision planting possible, the thing that Calvin had paid $14,000 extra for, the feature that the entire reason he'd bought this model over cheaper alternatives, was locked out by software, by a system 3 states away that didn't know his name, didn't know his soil, didn't know that he had a 400-acre window of optimal planting moisture that would close in 4 days if he didn't move. He called the dealer. The dealer opened a service ticket. The service ticket went to John Deere's regional support center. The support center said a technician would need to come out to perform a software diagnostic and reauthorization. The earliest available technician appointment was 6 days away. Calvin asked if there was anything he could do himself. The dealer said the software system was proprietary and that unauthorized attempts to access or modify it could void his warranty. Calvin asked how much of his warranty was left. The dealer checked. 14 months. Calvin asked what the repair would cost after the warranty expired. The dealer said a software diagnostic and reauthorization ran $340 per hour, typically requiring 2 to 4 hours of technician time, plus a $195 remote access fee, plus any parts flagged during the diagnostic. Calvin did the math in his head. He thanked the dealer and hung up. Then he called Dale Whitmore. Dale gave him a name. A man named Pete Schiller, 48 years old, who'd spent 16 years as a John Deere precision ag specialist before leaving to start his own agricultural technology consulting operation. Pete had worked on these exact systems. He understood the authentication architecture. He understood where the lock was and, more relevantly, he understood that the lock in many cases was not there to protect Calvin's tractor. It was there to protect John Deere's service revenue. Pete drove out that same afternoon. He spent 2 hours with the system. He found the authentication conflict, a miskeyed calibration parameter in the updated firmware that was causing the planting system integration to fail its handshake, and he corrected it. Not by cracking software, not by doing anything illegal, by understanding the system deeply enough to find the error and resolve it through the same diagnostic interface any authorized technician would use. Calvin was planting by 6 a.m. the next day. Morning, Pete's invoice was $280, including travel. The authorized dealer would have charged $340 an hour for 6 days from now. Calvin told 4 farmers about Pete Schiller before the week was out. This was the moment Dale's network stopped being a list of parts sources and started being something different, because what Pete represented wasn't just cheaper labor. Pete represented the knowledge that had been deliberately removed from farmers' hands. Pete represented the understanding of the machines that John Deere's new service model was designed to make inaccessible, not because farmers were incapable of understanding it, but because understanding it meant they wouldn't need to pay for it. The John Deere right to repair issue had been building for years in agricultural policy circles. Farmers and independent mechanics had been pushing back since at least 2015, when John Deere had begun rolling out software locks on major diagnostic functions. By 2021, the company had reached a voluntary agreement with the American Farm Bureau that was supposed to provide farmers with access to the tools and documentation needed to perform their own repairs. The agreement was announced. Press releases were issued, policy boxes were checked, and then, in practice, in the actual dealerships, in the actual service tickets, in the actual interactions between farmers and machines that cost $300,000 and needed to work during a 4-day planting window, almost nothing changed. The tools that were supposed to be accessible remained expensive. The documentation that was supposed to be shared remained incomplete. The diagnostic software that farmers were supposed to be able to use remained tethered to dealer hardware that cost thousands of dollars and required annual licensing fees. The voluntary agreement had solved the public relations problem without solving the actual problem. What it had done, though, without intending to, was radicalize a generation of farmers who had genuinely believed the company would follow through. By 2021, Dale's network had grown to 71 farmers. They were spread across 4 counties. Some of them had never met each other. What they shared was the list, the maintained, constantly updated list of mechanics, technicians, suppliers, and specialists who existed outside the dealer network and could handle what the dealer network increasingly couldn't or wouldn't at a price that didn't require refinancing a loan. The list now had 43 names on it. Independent mechanics, precision AG consultants who'd left the corporate system, hydraulic rebuild specialists, electronics technicians who'd worked on agricultural equipment for years and understood the systems without needing John Deere's proprietary interface, salvage yards that specialized in late model equipment and could source quality used components, OEM spec parts suppliers who manufactured to the same tolerances as the dealer parts at a fraction of the price. And it worked. It worked because the knowledge hadn't disappeared. It had just been redistributed. The dealer network had assumed that centralizing diagnostic authority, making the software the gatekeeper, would make independent repair impossible. What they hadn't accounted for was the fact that the people who had built their careers inside that system, who understood it from the inside out, were people who could leave. And when the corporate culture changed, when the pressure on service revenue meant prioritizing ticket throughput over actual customer relationships, many of them did leave. They went into pole barns and converted shops and home garages. They took their knowledge with them. And when farmers like Dale Whitmore started quietly looking for them, they were there. In the fall of 2021, a parts price increase came through that Dale's network had not seen coming. Even after everything they'd already documented, John Deere announced a new pricing structure for what it called integrated technology components, a category that now included not just software and electronics, but any mechanical part that interfaced with the tractor's digital systems. Given how deeply integrated the newer machines were, this category covered a majority of the drivetrain, the hydraulic system, and the emissions controls. The average price increase on integrated technology components was 38% across the board, top of the increases that had already happened, on top of the surcharges that were already in place. Dale ran the new numbers against his 6-year baseline. The cumulative average increase across his tracked line items was now 340%, 340%. He wrote it at the top of a new page in the notebook. He circled it twice. He didn't feel angry when he wrote it. He felt something quieter than anger. He felt the particular clarity that comes when the data finally catches up to what you already suspected, and the suspicion is confirmed in a way that removes any remaining doubt. He shared the new number with the network, and the network did what networks do when the information is clear and the stakes are real. It grew. By January 2022, there were 93 farmers in the network. No charter, no dues, no leadership structure. Just a shared list, a shared knowledge base, and a shared understanding that the relationship they thought they had with the brand they'd trusted was something that had to be rebuilt. Not with the corporation, but with each other. What they built worked differently than a dealership. It worked on trust instead of transaction. It worked on reputation instead of advertising. When Roy Alstead recommended a mechanic, that recommendation meant something, because Roy's farm was on the line if the mechanic wasn't good. When Dale's notebook said a part was available from a supplier in Wisconsin for $340 and the dealer was charging $1,190, the notebook was right because Dale had checked it himself and updated it himself and stood behind it with his own name. There was no software that could lock out that kind of knowledge. There was no algorithm that could price the trust that came from 3 decades of neighboring each other across the same roads, watching the same weather, surviving the same margin calls. John Deere's corporate model had optimized for revenue per transaction. It had done exactly what it set out to do. Parts revenue was up. Service contract margins were up. Shareholder returns were strong, but the model had made a calculation error. It had assumed that farmers who were loyal to a brand for 40 years would remain loyal when the brand's actual behavior made loyalty irrational. It had assumed that the switching cost, the complexity of moving to independent service, the learning curve of sourcing parts outside the network, was high enough to hold people inside the system regardless of the price. It had not accounted for what happens when people are both stubborn enough and smart enough to do the work. It had not accounted for Dale Whitmore's notebook. In the spring of 2022, a 29-year-old farmer named Tyler Goss came to Dale's shop looking for advice. Tyler had just taken over his family's operation. 900 acres, 2 tractors, a planter, a combine, all of it green, all of it financed, most of it under warranty. He was standing at the beginning of a farming life with equipment that cost more than his house and parts pricing that was accelerating faster than his crop revenue. He was scared, even if he wouldn't have used that word. Dale handed him the notebook. Tyler stood there in the shop doorway and read it for 20 minutes, without saying a word. When he looked up, he said, "Is any of this going to get better?" Dale wiped a grease smear off his knuckles and thought about that for a moment. "Probably not," he said. "Not from their end." Tyler asked what he was supposed to do. Dale said, "Learn everything you can about the machines you're running. Don't let the software be the only thing that understands your equipment. Build relationships with the people who know these systems outside the dealer structure. And don't let anyone convince you that paying 3 times too much is the cost of doing business." He paused. "And don't buy new if you can help it. Buy used, buy paid off, buy something you can work on." Tyler left with 3 names from the list and a photograph of 2 pages from the notebook. 6 months later, he was back. He'd found a 2016 John Deere 7310R at an estate auction in Missouri. Low hours. Paid $97,000 for a tractor that would have cost $228,000 new. Warranty was expired. Meant it was his in every sense. No software holds, no mandatory dealer diagnostics, no expedited handling fees on parts he could now source himself from the network Dale had handed him. He'd had Pete Schiller go through the electronics. He'd had a hydraulic specialist from the list go through the fluid systems. Total cost to get the machine fully inspected and ready. $1,100. He looked at Dale and said, "I think I understand now." Dale nodded. He'd seen this moment before with other farmers. The moment when the arithmetic became undeniable, when the myth of brand loyalty as a 2-way street finally dissolved, and what was left was just the math, clean and clear. By the end of 2023, the network had passed 140 farmers, the John Deere dealership that had served the region. Dale's network centered on reported its third consecutive year of declining service revenue. New equipment sales were down. Parts orders from the area were down. The dealer's own internal records, which Dale would eventually see fragments of second-hand through the service manager, who quietly left and later became one of the network's most valuable resources, showed that the decline tracked almost precisely with the growth of the list. Every farmer who joined the network was, on average, a $4,000 to $7,000 annual reduction in dealer service revenue, and to farmers times even the low end of that estimate. The math was not subtle. The dealership was still open, the sign was still green. But the parking lot told the real story. A lot that used to have 40 tractors and combines in rotation now had 14, most of them sitting longer than they used to. Service bays that ran 6 days a week now ran 4. Staff that numbered 28 now numbered 11. Not because Dale Whitmore had set out to bring down a dealership, he hadn't. He set out to fix his tractor without being charged 3 times what it was worth. What he'd built in the process was something that would outlast any individual repair, any single invoice, any one season's price increase. He'd built the thing that corporate efficiency models are never able to account for, the value of people who know each other, have made a decision together, without a charter or a contract or a meeting agenda, to stop paying for something that stopped being worth the price. Dale still farms. Both his tractors are paid off. He services them himself, or with help from people on the list, and has not written a check to a John Deere dealership for anything other than a filter and 2 sets of belts in the last 3 years. The notebook is 94 pages now. It doesn't have a title. But the last entry, written on a Tuesday in November in Dale's careful handwriting, ends with a sentence that might as well be the whole story. When they stopped working for us, we started working for each other. Turns out that works better.